The subway doors closed, and her life as an invisible single mom ended. Next stop, the Millionaire CEO, who refused to let her go. Emma Riley was running on fumes. It was the kind of exhaustion that no nap could cure, the kind that settled deep into her bones and made her limbs feel heavy, as though the air itself had thickened around her. She had spent the entire night pacing her tiny apartment with her 6-month-old daughter, Sarah, pressed against her chest, trying to soothe the baby's fever and shallow coughs. By morning, Emma's head throbbed, her back ached, and her eyes stung with dryness. She knew she should have stayed home, but there were groceries to buy, bills to pay, and no one else to lean on. The subway car shuddered as it barreled through the tunnels, its fluorescent lights flickering faintly. Emma clutched the stroller handle with one hand and held Sarah with the other, swaying gently to calm the infant's fussing. The seats were nearly full, commuters with their earbuds in or noses buried in newspapers and phones, all wrapped in the armor of indifference that big cities bred so well. No one offered her a smile, much less a seat. She was used to it. At the far end of the car, Alexander Hayes sat by the window, dressed in a tailored dark coat that looked almost out of place in the grimy subway. His posture was casual, but his eyes were distant, fixed on the blur of tunnels rushing past. Most people would have assumed he was just another businessman heading downtown, perhaps thinking about the markets or an upcoming meeting. But for Alexander, these subway rides were something different. He was 35, CEO of one of the largest investment firms in the city, a man whose face often appeared in glossy magazines and whose name stirred murmurs in boardrooms. Yet sometimes when the weight of endless decisions pressed too heavily on him, he escaped the insulated world of chauffeured cars and corner offices to ride among the people he rarely interacted with. Here, pressed shoulder to shoulder with strangers, he could breathe differently. He could remind himself what real life looked like. The train lurched, throwing Emma off balance. She caught herself on the seat beside Alexander, her knees trembling with fatigue. Sarah let out a small whimper, and Emma bounced her gently, whispering soothing words. She hadn't meant to sit, but her body made the choice for her. She lowered herself heavily onto the seat, the baby finally dozing against her chest. Emma told herself she would stay alert, that she would keep her eyes open. But the rhythmic clatter of the train, the warmth of the seat, and the months of sleepless nights caught up with her in a rush. Her eyelids drooped despite her best effort. Before she could stop herself, her head tilted sideways and landed softly against the shoulder of the man beside her. Alexander stiffened at the sudden weight. He turned his head slightly and saw her profile. The faint circles under her eyes, the strands of hair that had slipped loose around her face, the peaceful rise and fall of her chest as the baby's small hand clutched her sweater. He felt the curious stares of other passengers, the murmurs as a few of them noticed the scene. He could have shifted, could have cleared his throat to wake her, but something kept him still. It had been years since anyone leaned on him like this, not as a CEO or a man of power, but simply as another human being. There was a vulnerability in her trust, unconscious though it was, that unsettled him in a way no hostile negotiation ever had. He stayed quiet, his gaze forward, allowing her the small mercy of rest. Minutes passed, the train rattling through stations. Emma's breathing steadied, and Sarah remained curled against her, tiny and fragile. Alexander glanced at their reflection in the subway window, the powerful executive with the worn-down young mother asleep against him. Two worlds that should never have collided. And yet, here they were, pressed together in the anonymity of the underground, a silent secret only the steel walls of the train shared with them. When the train screeched to a halt at the next stop, Emma stirred awake. Realization hit her instantly and her cheeks flushed red. She pulled back quickly, eyes wide with embarrassment. I'm so sorry, she stammered, adjusting Sarah in her arms. I didn't mean to. Alexander turned his head toward her, and for the first time that day, a faint smile touched his lips. His voice was calm, steady, free of judgment. You must be exhausted. Emma froze, caught off guard by the gentleness in his tone. For a fleeting moment, she saw no trace of condescension in his expression, only understanding. And though she didn't know it yet, that unremarkable subway ride, and the stranger whose shoulder had caught her at her weakest, was the moment her life began to change in ways she never could have imagined. Emma's apology still lingered in the air, fragile and rushed, as if she feared he would scold her or, worse, pity her. She shifted Sarah higher against her chest, the baby's tiny hand grasping the edge of her sweater, while her own pulse drummed in her ears. Most men she encountered in the city had little patience for mothers, let alone single ones with crying infants. She braced herself for a cutting remark, but none came. Instead, the stranger's voice was low, calm, with an undertone she couldn't quite name. "You must be exhausted," he repeated, as though it were the most obvious truth in the world. Emma blinked at him, startled by his steady brown eyes. There was no judgment there, no disdain, just an observation, spoken plainly. She gave a small, self-conscious laugh and shook her head. "That obvious, huh?" Alexander studied her for a moment. He saw the shadows under her eyes, the lines that shouldn't have marked someone so young. She was 28, he guessed, but life had clearly aged her faster than time alone. He thought of all the women he usually encountered. Polished, immaculate, their exhaustion hidden behind perfect makeup and carefully chosen words. This woman carried hers openly, etched in her posture, in her cracked voice. It stirred something in him he hadn't expected to feel on this commute. An ache, almost protective in nature. "Babies don't exactly respect sleep schedules," he said lightly, trying to put her at ease. Emma looked at him in surprise, then let out a genuine laugh. The kind of laugh that sounded like it hadn't escaped her in weeks. "That's one way to put it. Sarah seems to think 3 in the morning is a great time to practice screaming competitions." The baby shifted, letting out a soft coo, and Alexander found himself leaning closer before he caught the impulse. "She's beautiful," he said quietly. Emma's expression softened. She looked down at her daughter, brushing a stray wisp of hair from her tiny forehead. "She's all I have," she murmured, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She bit her lip, realizing she had said too much to a stranger, but exhaustion made her careless. Alexander tilted his head slightly. "All you have?" he asked, not prying, just curious. Emma adjusted Sarah's blanket and avoided his gaze. "Her father isn't in the picture. It's just me now, which some days feels like enough, and other days feels impossible." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she quickly cleared her throat, as if covering a vulnerability she regretted showing. Alexander didn't respond right away. His own chest tightened unexpectedly at her words. He thought of his own late nights, of the emptiness of his penthouse, the quiet hum of success that never seemed to fill the hollow spaces in his life. He too knew the weight of carrying too much alone, though in different ways. He found himself saying, almost without thinking, "Impossible doesn't mean hopeless." Emma glanced at him, startled again. She had expected indifference, maybe polite silence, not comfort. For a moment their eyes held, and she felt something strange, the sense that this man, a stranger in the subway, was speaking from a place of experience. The train screeched into the next station. Passengers shuffled out and in, and the car grew noisy again. Emma adjusted Sarah and shifted her bag, as if preparing to leave. Alexander noticed and spoke before he could stop himself. "Let me help you," he said, gesturing toward the stroller folded near her feet. "The stairs at this stop are brutal." Emma hesitated. She was used to refusing help. Accepting it often meant owing something later, and she couldn't afford debts of any kind. Not financial, not emotional. But the sincerity in his tone disarmed her. Against her instincts, she nodded. When the train doors opened, Alexander lifted the stroller with practiced ease, carrying it up the grimy stairs while Emma followed with Sarah in her arms. She expected him to set it down at the top, offer a polite goodbye, and vanish into the crowd. Instead, he paused, looking at her as though weighing whether to say more. "You shouldn't have to do this all alone," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Emma's breath caught. It was a dangerous thing for her to hear, because it sounded too much like hope. She forced a smile, though her heart ached with the weight of it. "Alone is all I know," she whispered. Then with a small nod, she turned and walked toward the street, her baby bundled close. Alexander stood at the top of the stairs, watching her disappear into the tide of the city. Something inside him shifted, a restlessness he couldn't name. He had come to the subway to escape, to think. Instead, he had stumbled upon a story he couldn't stop replaying in his mind. A woman too tired to hold her head up, yet strong enough to carry an entire world on her shoulders. And for the first time in a long time, Alexander Hayes felt that his carefully built life, the skyscraper office, the endless boardrooms, the chauffeured cars, had been interrupted by something real, something he wasn't sure he could let go of. 2 days later, the city was gray with drizzle, the kind of day when everything seemed heavier, the sidewalks slick, the air thick, the weight of life pressing just a little harder on tired shoulders. Emma tugged her coat tighter around herself as she maneuvered Sarah's stroller toward the corner grocery store. Her wallet was lighter than ever, and she had spent the morning at the kitchen table with a scrap of paper, carefully writing out a shopping list. Bread, milk, baby formula, a few vegetables if she could manage. She had crossed off coffee and meat with a sigh. Essentials only, survival only. Inside the store, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, reflecting off linoleum that had long since lost its shine. Emma moved slowly down the aisles, balancing Sarah's needs with the few dollars in her pocket. She placed a carton of milk in the basket, then paused at the shelf of formula. Her heart squeezed. The price had gone up again. She did the math in her head. Rent, electricity, the inhaler Sarah's pediatrician had recommended in case her cough came back. Everything was stacked like dominoes, ready to topple at the slightest touch. She picked up the formula anyway, praying she could stretch the rest. She stood at the checkout counter, fingers trembling as she counted her coins. The line behind her grew impatient. She heard someone sigh loudly, mutter under their breath about people holding things up. Heat rushed to her cheeks as she recounted the change, praying it would be enough. Emma! Her head snapped up. The voice was calm, familiar. Standing just a few feet away, holding an umbrella and a small bag of groceries, was the man from the subway. Alexander. Her pulse jumped. You? She almost dropped the coins in her hands. What are you doing here? He gave a small smile as if the coincidence amused him. Buying groceries, same as you. His eyes flicked to Sarah, who squirmed in the stroller, and then back to Emma's face. I didn't expect to see you again. Emma's embarrassment deepened as she handed the cashier the coins. The total was a few dollars short. The cashier's bored expression hardened. You're short. Emma swallowed hard, reaching for the formula to put it back. But before she could, Alexander set a crisp bill on the counter. I'll cover it. Emma froze. No, you don't have to. It's not charity, he said firmly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. It's just help. Her hands trembled as the cashier took the bill. Emma muttered a reluctant thank you, her pride warring with the sharp sting of humiliation. She hated owing anyone, least of all a stranger. But when she looked at him, there was no trace of condescension in his face, only a kind of steady patience. They stepped outside together into the drizzle. Alexander held the umbrella over her as she juggled the bag in the stroller. She tried to protest, but he ignored it. They walked in silence for a block, the city noise muffled by the patter of rain. Finally, Emma blurted out, "Why are you even doing this?" "You don't know me." Alexander looked at her for a long moment, his dark hair damp at the edges, his brown eyes unreadable. "Maybe that's why," he said, "because sometimes strangers see what the people closest to us overlook." Emma blinked, startled by the weight of his words. She didn't know what to say. And then it happened. From across the street, someone called out loudly, "Mr. Hayes?" Emma's stomach dropped. A young man in a suit, clearly an employee judging by the ID badge clipped to his coat, was staring at Alexander with wide eyes. "Mr. Hayes, sir, I didn't expect to see you here." Emma turned slowly toward Alexander, confusion and dawning realization twisting her insides. "Mr. Hayes," she repeated, her voice low and sharp. "As in Alexander Hayes?" The name hit her like a punch. Everyone in New York knew it. The millionaire CEO. The man who controlled one of the city's biggest firms. The man whose face she'd seen in newspapers she could never afford to buy. She stepped back a fraction, the rain stinging her cheeks. Her mind reeled with the truth unraveling in front of her. The stranger from the subway, the man who held her stroller, the man who quietly paid for her groceries. He wasn't just anyone. He was everything she had spent her life believing was untouchable. "You're him," she whispered, her voice shaking. "The millionaire CEO." The words hung heavy in the rain, and for the first time since their paths had crossed, Emma wished she hadn't leaned on his shoulder at all. Because now the fragile thread of trust between them was shattering before it had even begun. Emma could still feel the word burning on her tongue, as if she had swallowed fire. Millionaire, CEO. The syllables made her chest tighten and her palms sweat. She stared at Alexander as though she were looking at a stranger for the first time. Not the man who had quietly held her daughter's stroller, who had let her rest against his shoulder without complaint. The drizzle turned to steady rain, spattering against the umbrella he still held above them. The small, protective gesture only made her angrier. "You lied to me," she said finally, her voice cracking under the strain of fury and disbelief. Alexander's jaw tightened. "I didn't lie. I just didn't." "You didn't tell me who you were," she cut in sharply. "Do you have any idea what that feels like? To think I was talking to a man on the subway, just a man, someone who understood, and instead, I was confiding in one of them?" Her voice rose, trembling with a bitterness she hadn't realized she'd been carrying for years. She gestured helplessly to the city around them. The gleaming towers, the bustling streets, the world that belonged to people like him. "You're the kind of man who lives in glass offices hundreds of feet above the rest of us. You don't worry about running out of money at the checkout counter. You don't fall asleep on trains because you can't afford a babysitter. You don't—" Her voice broke. "You don't know what it's like to be me." The rain fell harder, plastering her hair to her forehead. Sarah stirred in the stroller, letting out a soft whimper, as if sensing the storm brewing in her mother's chest. Emma bent quickly to adjust the blanket, more to hide her tears than to shield the baby. Alexander lowered the umbrella slightly, his voice steady but not defensive. "You're right. I don't know what it's like to be you, but don't mistake silence for deceit. I didn't tell you my name because it didn't matter." "Not then." Emma looked up at him sharply, eyes shining with anger. "Not to you, but it matters to me. Because men like you have the luxury of pretending to be ordinary for a train ride. I don't. This," she gestured to her stroller, to her worn shoes, to her soaked coat. "This is my life every day. And you walked into it like it was some experiment." Her words cut him, though he didn't flinch. He thought of all the nights he had sat in boardrooms debating the fate of properties, the weight of profits over tenants. He thought of the stories that came across his desk. Faceless names, anonymous accounts of families on the brink. And now, standing before him, soaked in rain and fury, was the human face of everything his company affected. "I didn't sit on that train to play pretend," he said softly. "I sat there because sometimes I need to remember what the world feels like outside of my glass office. And that night I saw you, not as a stranger, not as a case study, just you." Emma's throat tightened, her fury twisting into something more painful. She wanted to believe him, but the gulf between them felt too wide, the imbalance too cruel. "You can say whatever you want," she whispered. "At the end of the day, you'll go home to your penthouse, and I'll go home to an apartment where I pray the heater doesn't break." The drizzle had turned into a downpour, soaking them both despite the umbrella. The street around them blurred with movement. Honking cars, rushing pedestrians, the occasional impatient shout. Yet the two of them stood still, locked in a moment neither could walk away from. Finally, Alexander spoke again, his tone firmer this time. "You're right to be angry. You're right to feel betrayed, but don't mistake who I am on paper for who I am standing in front of you. I don't want your trust because of my name, Emma. I want it in spite of it." Her name on his lips startled her, grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. For a flicker of a second, she saw not the CEO whose name filled business pages, but the man who had carried her stroller up a flight of stairs. The man who had paid for formula without a second thought. The man whose shoulder had been steady enough to catch her when she had no strength left. But the flicker faded quickly, swallowed by the reality of who he was. Emma shook her head, her voice hoarse. "I don't know if I can forgive you for not telling me, because when you didn't, you made me feel safe. And now I feel like a fool." Alexander wanted to reach for her, to take her hand, to bridge the distance with touch since words seemed to fail. But he stayed rooted, the weight of her pain holding him back. He knew this was a wound that wouldn't heal with apologies or gestures. Emma turned the stroller abruptly and started down the slick sidewalk. "Please, just leave me alone," she said without looking back. He watched her retreat into the rain, her figure growing smaller, swallowed by the crowd. For the first time in years, Alexander Hayes felt powerless. Not in the way boardroom losses made him powerless, but in a deeper, more human way. He had built empires, closed impossible deals, and commanded respect in every room he entered. But none of that mattered now, because he had just lost the fragile trust of the one woman who hadn't cared about his empire at all. And for reasons he couldn't yet understand, that loss hurt more than anything else. Emma thought she could push the encounter into the shadows of memory, bury it beneath the mountain of day-to-day struggles that left no room for distractions. But the world had other plans. Within 3 days of their rain-soaked confrontation, her phone lit up with messages from friends she hadn't heard from in months, and neighbors whispered when she wheeled Sarah into the corner bodega. Someone had seen her on the street with him. And then the articles began. The headlines were brutal in their curiosity. Who is the mystery woman with Millionaire CEO Alexander Hayes? Subway angel or gold digger? Hayes spotted buying formula for single mother. They took the smallest fragments of truth, the groceries, the stroller, the rain, and spun them into stories that made Emma's stomach twist with dread. Strangers speculated about her online, inventing entire backstories, assigning her motives she had never imagined. Some painted her as a tragic figure, others as a schemer. None of them knew the reality of her sleepless nights, of her cracked hands from washing bottles in cold water, of her constant fear that one more bill might shatter the fragile balance of her life. At first, she tried to ignore it, but it became impossible when a reporter showed up outside her building, camera slung over his shoulder, asking if she had snared the city's most eligible CEO. She shut the door in his face, trembling so hard she could barely lock it. Inside, Sarah cried, frightened by her mother's panic. Emma held her close, whispering promises that felt like lies. "It's okay, baby. We're safe. We're safe across town." In the glass tower that loomed over the city, Alexander was facing his own storm. The board of directors had summoned him to an emergency meeting. The long mahogany table was lined with faces that had once admired him, but now glared with suspicion. Thomas Caraway, the sharp-tongued elder statesman of the board, slammed a newspaper onto the table. On its front page was a blurred photo of Emma pushing the stroller under Alexander's umbrella. "Care to explain this, Hayes?" Caraway demanded. "Your personal life is bleeding into the company's reputation. Investors are nervous. They think you're distracted, compromised." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his face calm but his jaw tight. "What you're looking at is a photograph of a woman trying to buy formula for her child. What I did was human decency, not a scandal." Elaine Foster, another director, arched an eyebrow. "You think the public cares about nuance? To them, it looks like favoritism. It looks like weakness. You're associating with someone far beneath your station, and it raises questions." Alexander's eyes darkened. "Beneath my station?" His voice was low but dangerous. "Emma Riley is a single mother who has shown more strength in surviving each day than half this board has shown in their entire careers. Don't you dare diminish her." The room went silent. A few directors shifted uncomfortably, but Caraway leaned forward, unyielding. "Then answer us this. Is she just a charity case to you, or is there something more? Because if you can't keep your private life separate from this company, you put us all at risk." Alexander held their stares, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on him. He could protect himself, deny any connection, step away from Emma publicly, let her fade back into anonymity. It would be easy, expected, safe. But the thought of abandoning her, of letting the world shred her without standing beside her, made his chest burn with something he hadn't felt in years. Conviction. "She's not a risk," he said finally, his voice firm. "She's a reminder of why what we build matters, of why we can't treat people like numbers on a balance sheet. If that frightens you, then maybe you're in the wrong business." The board erupted in protest, voices overlapping. "Irresponsible. Sentimental nonsense. Think of the shareholders." But Alexander let the storm wash over him. For the first time in his career, he wasn't bending to their logic. He was standing against it. Meanwhile, Emma sat in her dim apartment, rocking Sarah to sleep as the glow of her phone illuminated the latest article. Sources say Hayes defends. Mystery mother behind closed doors. Her throat tightened. She didn't know how the press had gotten those details, but the realization struck her hard. He hadn't thrown her to the wolves. He had defended her, even when it endangered him. She pressed her lips to Sarah's forehead, whispering through tears, "What is he doing to us, baby girl? What is he doing to me?" Because deep down, beneath the fear and the shame and the fury, Emma felt something else growing. Something even more dangerous than scandal. A flicker of hope. Emma woke to the sound of pounding at her door, not the gentle knock of a neighbor, but the heavy, insistent thud of someone who refused to be ignored. Her heart leapt into her throat. She rushed to the door, clutching Sarah against her chest, and pressed her eye to the peephole. A man with a camera hung from his neck. Another with a microphone stood behind him, and a third held up his phone as though filming live. Her stomach dropped. They had found her. She backed away quickly, whispering to Sarah, "Shh, baby, it's okay." But the voices outside were loud, echoing down the hall. "Emma Riley, is it true you're in a relationship with Alexander Hayes?" "Emma, how long have you known the CEO? Are you planning to take legal action against his company?" Emma staggered to the kitchen window, pulling back the curtain. Below on the street, a cluster of reporters and photographers stood gathered around her building's entrance, umbrellas bobbing in the drizzle. Some shouted questions at anyone who entered or left. A man from the third floor tried to push through, swearing, but the reporters barely moved aside. It was a circus, and she was the main attraction. Her phone buzzed uncontrollably on the counter. She hesitated, then picked it up. Dozens of notifications lit the screen. News articles with her name in the headline, social media posts dissecting her life, strangers debating whether she was a victim or a manipulator. One headline made her knees give way. Identity revealed. The woman at the center of Hayes' scandal is 28-year-old single mother, Emma Riley. They knew everything. Her name, her age, where she lived, even details about Sarah. A photo of her from years ago, smiling shyly at a cousin's wedding, was splashed across the internet. The comments beneath it clawed at her. She looks like she planned this. Probably saw him as a ticket out. That poor baby, dragged into this mess. Emma pressed her palm to her mouth to stop the sob that threatened to escape. She had wanted nothing more than to remain invisible, to survive quietly in the corners of the city. Now strangers knew her better than her neighbors ever had, and they hated her for it. Hours blurred together. She didn't dare step outside. When Sarah cried, she rocked her by the window, praying the noise wouldn't carry to the hall where cameras waited. She called her sister in another state, desperate for comfort, but her sister's voice was tight, worried. "Emma, maybe you should talk to him. He has resources. He can protect you." Emma bristled. "He's the reason I'm in this mess." Her sister hesitated. "Or maybe he's the only one who can get you out." As if summoned, her phone buzzed again, this time with a number she didn't recognize. She almost ignored it, but something told her to answer. Alexander's voice came through, steady but urgent. "Emma." She closed her eyes, leaning against the wall. "They know. They know everything I saw," he admitted. "I'm sorry. I never wanted this for you." "You didn't stop it," she snapped, her voice trembling with exhaustion. "You could have told them the truth from the beginning. You could have—" She broke off, tears choking her. "You should have let me go." There was silence on the other end, and then Alexander's voice, low and fierce. "I couldn't, and I won't. Listen to me, Emma. I've arranged for security. They can be outside your building within the hour. You don't have to go through this alone." She shook her head, even though he couldn't see it. "I never asked you for protection. I never asked you for any of this. But you have it," he said firmly, "because you and Sarah don't deserve to be hunted like prey. Not because of me, not because of anyone." Emma pressed her forehead against the cool plaster of the wall, torn between fury and a fragile, dangerous relief. She wanted to scream at him to leave her life, to let her crawl back into the anonymity she had fought so hard to maintain. But part of her knew that door had closed the moment she fell asleep on his shoulder in the subway. The banging at the door grew louder, the shouts more desperate. Emma clutched Sarah tighter, whispering into her baby's soft hair, "I don't know how to protect us anymore." And in that moment, as her world cracked open for strangers to feast on, she realized something terrifying. She would have to decide whether to trust the man who had dragged her into the storm or face it alone. The boardroom felt more like a courtroom than a place of business. The air was thick with tension, polished mahogany reflecting the overhead lights, the city skyline framed by floor-to-ceiling windows behind the directors. Alexander walked in alone, shoulders squared, his face calm but carved with fatigue. The whispers followed him as he crossed the carpet. He knew what this meeting was. He had read enough between the lines of their terse emails and sudden summons. This was not a conversation. This was a trial. Thomas Caraway, the longest-serving director and a man who thrived on control, was the first to speak. His voice cut across the room with the precision of a scalpel. Mr. Hayes, this company is under siege in the press, and you are the reason. Investors are jittery, clients are calling. The name Cole Venture Group is now tied to a tabloid circus, and at the center of that circus is you and your... He hesitated, his lip curling slightly. Companion. Alexander took his seat slowly, folding his hands on the table, his dark eyes meeting Caraway's without flinching. Her name is Emma Riley, he said evenly, and she is not a circus act. She is a woman who was wronged by one of our subsidiaries and deserves dignity. Elaine Foster, her voice smooth but cold, leaned forward. Dignity does not increase shareholder value, Alexander. Your personal entanglement has blurred the line between leadership and recklessness. It's not just about her. It's about what your actions say about us. That we are vulnerable to distraction, to scandal, that we allow sentiment to cloud strategy. Another director chimed in, voice sharp. This isn't the first headline tied to you, but it's the first that makes you look weak. And weakness, mister. Haze is fatal in our industry. For a moment, Alexander let the silence stretch, absorbing their words. He could feel their hostility like a current in the air, buzzing, relentless. And then he leaned forward, his voice calm but carrying the weight of steel. What you call weakness, I call humanity. What you call distraction, I call perspective. The truth is that Emma isn't a threat to this company. She's a mirror. She shows us what we don't want to see, that our profits are built on people who suffer while we congratulate ourselves in this room. Caraway slammed his palm against the table, the sharp sound startling a few of the others. This is not a lecture hall. This is a boardroom, and the only question before us is whether you are fit to remain CEO. You are dragging your personal life into corporate governance, and that makes you a liability. The stock is dropping. Investors demand reassurance, and unless you can sever ties with this woman publicly and immediately, we will have no choice but to call for a vote of no confidence. The words hung heavy in the room. Alexander felt the weight of them, the enormity of what they meant. His entire career, the empire he had built, the legacy of decisions and risks that had made him who he was, all of it balanced on the edge of this moment. All he had to do was nod, issue a statement, claim Emma meant nothing, and the storm would pass. He could keep everything. But the thought of betraying her, of leaving her alone in the glare of cameras while he slipped safely behind walls of power, filled him with revulsion. He thought of Sarah's tiny hand clutching Emma's sweater, of the exhaustion etched into Emma's face as she tried to stretch pennies into meals. He thought of the look in her eyes when she realized who he was. Hurt, betrayal, and something deeper that she hadn't dared to name. When he spoke, his voice was low, but carried to every corner of the boardroom. If you want a CEO who will abandon a woman and her child because she became inconvenient, then you are right. I am not that man. I will not sever ties with Emma Riley. I will not pretend she doesn't matter. Because if I do, then everything I've built, everything we claim this company stands for, is worthless. Gasps rippled through the room. Elaine shook her head in disbelief. You're willing to sacrifice your position for her? Alexander's gaze swept the table, steady and unflinching. I am willing to sacrifice my position to remain the kind of man who can look at himself in the mirror. If that threatens you, then vote me out. But know this, the world is watching, they see what we do now. And history will remember whether we chose cruelty or courage, the directors murmured among themselves, their polished facades cracking under the force of his conviction. Caraway's face was red with fury, but Alexander could see the hesitation in the others, the seed of doubt his words had planted. The meeting ended without a vote, but not without a warning. You're on thin ice, Hayes, Caraway spat as Alexander stood to leave. One wrong move and you're finished. Alexander didn't reply. He walked out of the boardroom with his shoulders squared, every step heavy with the knowledge that the battle was far from over. Outside the glass doors, his assistant handed him a phone with breaking news on the screen. Another article, this one splashed with Emma's photo, Sarah visible in the stroller. The headline read, "Who is the woman the CEO refuses to abandon?" Alexander stared at the image, his jaw tightening. They wanted him to treat her as a liability. But to him, she was already something far more dangerous. The reason he could no longer hide behind the armor of power. And for the first time in years, Alexander Hayes felt not trapped, but free. The day of the shareholder meeting dawned sharp and cold, the kind of morning when the city seemed to hold its breath. Outside the Coal Venture Group headquarters, the sidewalks were a battlefield. Reporters clustered behind barricades, their cameras poised like weapons, flashes bursting in quick, merciless rhythms. News vans lined the street, satellite dishes pointed to the sky, anchors speaking into microphones about the most consequential meeting of Alexander Hayes' career. Passers-by slowed to gawk, whispering as if they were watching history unfold in real time. Emma stood across the street, her hood pulled low, clutching Sarah's stroller handle with trembling fingers. She had promised herself she wouldn't come, that she would stay away from this circus. But Alexander had asked her the night before, his voice hoarse but steady. "I can't do this if I know you're hiding. Just be there. Even if I can't see you, just be there." So she had come, though every nerve in her body screamed at her to turn back. Inside the gleaming skyscraper, the auditorium was already filled. Hundreds of shareholders packed the rows of seats, their murmurs a restless tide. At the front, the board sat in a rigid line, their expressions grave. Caraway was there, his jaw clenched, ready to deliver the final blow. Elaine sat beside him, her arms crossed, her face an unreadable mask. When Alexander entered, the room hushed. He walked with measured steps to the podium, dressed in a simple dark suit, no tie. His hair was slightly disheveled, his eyes shadowed with fatigue, but his presence was undeniable. He didn't stand like a man defending himself. He stood like a man with nothing left to lose. He didn't begin with pleasantries. "You've all seen the headlines. You've all read the speculation, and you've all seen her face, Emma Riley." He let her name linger in the air, a deliberate defiance. "The media has reduced her to a tabloid caricature, a footnote in my life. But she is not a scandal. She is a woman, a mother, a tenant of one of our properties who was nearly forced onto the street because of our decisions." The audience shifted uneasily, but he pressed on. "I could stand here and deny everything. I could tell you Emma means nothing to me, that the child in the photos is not my concern, that it was all a misunderstanding. If I did that, the stock might rise tomorrow. The board might sigh with relief, and my reputation would be safe." He paused, his voice lowering. "But it would be a lie. Because the truth is, Emma means everything. Not because of gossip, not because of appearances, but because she reminded me what it means to be human in a world where humanity is treated as weakness. She showed me that leadership without compassion is just power in a suit. And I will not apologize for standing by her." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras clicked furiously. On the board's bench, Caraway leaned forward, his face crimson. "You're destroying yourself, Hayes," he hissed. Alexander's gaze snapped to him, unwavering. "No, Thomas. I'm saving myself. For years, I've let this company define me, reduce me to numbers and profits. But I refuse to let it strip me of my integrity. If defending a single mother makes me unfit to lead in your eyes, then take this title from me. But don't mistake silence for safety. The world is watching, and they will not forgive us if we choose cruelty over conscience." The words hung in the air, heavy and electric. For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly, a man in the back rose to his feet and began to clap. Another joined him, and another. The applause spread like a fire, rolling through the room until nearly the entire auditorium was on its feet. The sound thundered off the glass walls, drowning out the furious whispers of the board. Outside, Emma heard the muffled roar through the doors and felt tears blur her vision. She hadn't wanted this. The attention, the chaos, the way her private life had been torn open. But as she stood there with Sarah, she realized she wasn't just the subject of a scandal anymore. She was part of something larger, something that had shaken the walls of power. The vote was called, as procedure required. Caraway's voice was sharp with fury as he demanded Alexander's removal. But the momentum had shifted. Too many shareholders had been moved. Too many were swayed by the spectacle of a man willing to risk everything for principle. When the tally was announced, the room erupted again. Alexander Hayes would remain CEO, not because he bent to fear, but because he defied it. When the meeting ended, Alexander slipped out through a side corridor, away from the cameras and reporters. Emma was waiting in the shadows near the service entrance, her hood still pulled low, her heart hammering. He looked at her, his face pale but lit with a spark she hadn't seen before. "You came," he said, his voice rough with relief. Emma swallowed hard, unable to stop the tears now. "I heard everything." He stepped closer, his gaze searching hers. "I don't know what tomorrow will look like. The press won't stop. The board will keep fighting me. But today, Emma, today I chose you, and I'll keep choosing you for a moment." The world fell away. The flashing cameras, the angry headlines, the weight of judgment. It was just him, standing before her with nothing but raw truth, and her, holding the child who had once made her believe she had to face the world alone. Emma let out a shaky laugh through her tears. "You're insane." "Probably," Alexander admitted, a tired smile breaking across his face. "But I'd rather be insane with you than sane without you." She pressed her forehead against his chest. Sarah nestled safely between them. And for the first time since the nightmare began, Emma allowed herself to believe in something she had long forgotten. The possibility of a future not defined by survival, but by hope. As the author, looking back at the ending of the story, what strikes me most is how the true climax was not in Alexander keeping his position or Emma being freed from scandal, but in both of them reclaiming their dignity. Emma began the story as invisible, someone who survived by making herself small, blending into the city's shadows with her baby as her only anchor. By the end, she had been forced into a spotlight she never wanted, yet she stood there without breaking. Her pain was turned into spectacle, but her resilience made her more than a headline. It made her human in a way that no rumor could erase. Alexander, on the other hand, started as a man trapped in the gilded cage of power. He wore his wealth like armor, escaping to the subway just to breathe. But it took Emma's exhaustion, her brutal honesty, and her courage to show him that real leadership isn't about control, it's about conscience. His victory wasn't simply surviving the board's challenge, it was daring to redefine what strength looks like in a world that mistakes compassion for weakness. The ending is powerful because it's both fragile and triumphant. Their lives aren't suddenly perfect. The press will still circle, the board will still scheme, the world will still judge. But now they face it together. And in that choice lies the heart of the story. Sometimes the most shocking, life-changing thing isn't betrayal, scandal, or loss. It's the discovery that hope and love can survive even under the harshest lights.